Alright, let's talk about the dystopian genre. Dystopian fiction is actually one of my personal favorite genres, so I'm super excited to talk about it this month. I first got into dystopian fiction when I was in elementary school and middle school in the early 2000s. Around that time, a lot of popular dystopian books were coming out, like the Among the Hidden series by Margaret Peterson Haddix, and The Hunger Games came out a little bit after that. It was a really popular time for dystopian fiction. However, the genre has a much longer history than that. It's quite a bit older than, my elementary school years. It's actually kind of the opposite, and in some ways, a reaction to the idea of utopian fiction, which basically is a story that takes place in a perfect world. The word utopia was coined by Sir Thomas More in 1516 for his novel Utopia, which, as you might expect, depicts a utopian society. Dystopian fiction came a little bit later than that. I was able to find some early examples from the 19th and even 18th centuries. Like, for instance, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells was an early dystopian novel. Although it doesn't quite fit dystopian as we know it today, it certainly has a lot of the same characteristics. I even have seen Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift cited as a very early example of a dystopian novel. However, a lot of the big-name dystopian classics that you're probably aware of came from the mid-20th century. Things like Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World, 1984, Animal Farm, The Handmaid's Tale, and so on and so forth. I think we kind of tend to think of dystopian as largely a young adult genre nowadays, but that definitely was not the case back in those early days in the 20th century. Most dystopian novels back then were written primarily for adults, and they usually don't feature teenage characters as the protagonists. Instead, it's usually someone who is an adult in that world, who has their role in society all figured out, and they've lived their whole life so far without really questioning anything, and they're just barely starting to. Middle grade and young adult dystopian novels came later, around the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. One really famous example of a children's dystopian novel that I believe was one of the first was The Giver by Lois Lowry. The Giver takes place in a seemingly perfect society, but as the reader and the main character discover, it's not really as perfect as it seems. Another early children's dystopia that personally I really like is Among the Hidden by Margaret Peterson Haddix. This was probably the first, no, I think it wasn't the first dystopian book that I read. I think it was actually the third book in this series, Among the Betrayed, that was the first one that I read, because I accidentally read them out of order. I don't recommend doing that, by the way. Among the Betrayed is not the one to start with. You won't have a clue what's going on. In any case, the dystopian genre turned out to be very well suited to books for older children and teenagers, and it really took off in the young adult genre in the early 2000s and 2010s. You probably remember when everyone was talking about The Hunger Games and Divergent. And those were just the tip of the iceberg. If you walked into a Barnes & Noble around that time and you looked in the teen section, so many dystopian books. And I was a teenager around that time, so I read quite a few of those. However, I don't know about you, but it seems like there's a little bit less of an interest in dystopian fiction recently, particularly in the last few years. And I think that that might be explained by just everything that's gone on in the world in the past couple of years and how, frankly, dystopian some of it has felt. Like, this whole thing with the pandemic has seemed kind of like the setup for a dystopian story. In fact, the dystopian TV show Black Mirror actually halted production in the early days of the pandemic because, as the show's creator put it, "I don't know what stomach there would be for stories about societies falling apart." However, it's a genre that's been around for a long time, and I think as long as there are serious problems in society, which obviously there continue to be, there will be a dystopian genre because there will be stories that take our current problems and explore what they would look like taken to their worst extremes. Dystopian stories, like a lot of science fiction, they're not set in our present-day world, but they're not totally disconnected from our modern reality. In fact, a lot of them explore ideas that the author finds disturbing in the present day, or speculation about things that could go wrong in the future. They're often written as sort of warnings or cautionary tales about the directions that we don't want to see our society go. Another thing that they have in common is that they typically take place in very strictly controlled societies. It's not enough for the world to be bad for it to be a dystopian story. It also has to be a world in which there is very little hope of changing things, and there are people in charge who are trying to keep it the way that it is. So there could be stories about societies that are not great places to live, but they may not have that aspect of control or oppression that's typical of dystopian novels. For instance, I know that there might be some debate about this, but I don't personally consider zombie apocalypse novels to be dystopian, because the thing that makes those terrible places to live, it doesn't really have anything to do with the way that society is set up. Now, depending on the way that people react to the zombie apocalypse and the kind of societies that get set up among the survivors, I could see there being a dystopian society in a zombie apocalypse world, but I wouldn't see the fact that the Earth is overrun by zombies as being inherently dystopian on its own. If it's just about a bunch of survivors trying to survive, then that's not particularly dystopian, despite the fact that you wouldn't really want to live there. On the topic of the apocalypse, dystopian stories can be but are not necessarily either apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic. Apocalyptic meaning it takes place in what seems to be like the end times, and post-apocalyptic meaning it takes place after the end and there aren't a lot of survivors and whatnot. It's pretty popular for dystopian novels to take place in a world where either nuclear warfare or global warming or violent revolution or some sort of cataclysmic event has changed society in drastic ways. But there are also ones where it seems like this is just the way that things have gone. Like, for example, in the young adult dystopian series Matched by Ali Kandi, I don't remember there being any implication of a world-shattering cataclysmic event that led to society being set up this way. In fact, it was pretty much a utopian future on the surface. So that brings me to my other point that dystopian novels can also be either a false utopia or a utopia gone terribly wrong. Maybe it was set up with good intentions. Maybe people thought, things will actually be much better this way. And then it didn't turn out that way because they didn't really think through the implications of what they were doing or what they were giving up. Or it could be that the people there don't really question the way that things are and don't really know anything else. Like The Society and the Giver, for instance, it's obvious to a modern day reader, even long before the terrible twist is revealed about what being released means, it's obvious even before that the society is messed up, that they have given up things that aren't worth giving up, no matter what they've gained from it. But to the characters, they don't understand that. They don't know what they're missing out on. So as you can probably see from this video, there are a lot of subgenres of dystopian fiction. It can be meant either for adults or for children or teenagers. It can be like a false utopia where everything seems perfect, or a terrible post-apocalyptic world where nothing is right. And whatever makes a particular world dystopian often reflects something that is troubling in our world today and could potentially grow into a bigger problem. It's also not just a book genre. There are dystopian movies and TV shows as well. And although it's no longer experiencing the extreme levels of popularity that it did about a decade ago, it's still a pretty popular genre and has been for quite a while. So I think we'll continue to see a lot of the dystopian genre in the future.